Welcome to another CJOB 68 exclusive. Inside the mind of George A. Romero, the grandfather of the zombie, the director of Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. Yeah, he knows zombies. Here's your host, John Copsey.
George A. Romero never set out to revolutionize horror films. After graduating from a college commercial art course in 1960, George got together with a group of like-minded people interested in filmmaking and formed a company making industrial training films and beer commercials for the local Pittsburgh market. George, before your entry into feature-length filmmaking, I understand you got your big break working with the guru of children's television programming.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood.
Actually, my very first job as a filmmaker was for Fred. I mean, Fred was a wonderful guy. What you see is what you get. The guy on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is actually Fred. That's exactly the way he was. He was a wonderful guy and gave a lot of people breaks and a start. Everyone that I know that is working professionally in any kind of electronic media today from Pittsburgh got their start with Fred. I mean, when I was working there, Michael Keaton was a grip on the set. So I shot these little films. Fred had a device called picture-picture where the trolley would come by and a movie screen would come down and he'd show you a little movie about how they make light bulbs. Very simplified for young viewers. That was my gig. That was my first professional gig, was shooting those pictures for Fred Rogers. Now, I don't know why Fred would hire a scary guy.
People must not bite other people.
But he did.
Well, you didn't become a scary guy until a little later, is that right?
True.
Right. But the elements were percolating.
Yeah, although had you seen me at the time, you might have thought me pretty scary. Long hair.
Well, that was the Summer of Love or thereabouts, I guess.
All that, yeah.
So Latent Image decided to get into the big-time movie business. So what sparked that interest?
We just wanted to make a film.
Okay. And what type of film originally did you conceive? Was it a horror film, or did you have grander aspirations, so to speak?
We did. I mean, the first script that I wrote was a very high-minded, sort of Ingmar Bergman-esque thing set in the medieval times. It was a teenage coming-of-age story, and we showed it to people, and everybody said, "What's this?" And we said, well, maybe we should do something a little more commercial.
An experience in shock, more shattering than your strangest nightmare. Night of the Living Dead.
I've always loved horror, and I grew up on EC comic books, all horror films. When I was old enough to go to the movies alone, those were the movies that I went to see. And I had written a little short story. We pulled that out of the file, and one of my partners and I, Jack Russo, sat down and wrote a screenplay for it, and that became Night of the Living Dead.
And were you influenced at all by Richard Matheson's I Am Legend?
Completely. Sure. Richard starts that book with one man left alive. Everyone in the world has become a vampire because of some disease. There's only one man left, thus the title. Vampires used to be legend. Now I am legend because I'm the only human alive. I thought that it was about revolution, and I wanted to do something like that. I didn't directly rip off the idea, but it was certainly strongly inspired by I Am Legend. I couldn't use vampires, so I invented the idea that dead people were coming back to life. I never thought of them as zombies. I never called them zombies in that first film, because to me, back then, zombies were voodoo boys in the Caribbean doing the wet work for Lugosi.
Right.
When people started to write about the film and call them zombies, I just sort of jumped on board.
Prior to that, they were ghouls or just...
Yeah, well, that's whatever. What we called them, ghouls, flesh eaters, those things. When you're writing dialogue, what do you say? This thing suddenly takes over the world, right? They're not going to look out there and say, oh, there's zombies around. Like in the old Godzilla movies, right? This big monster comes over the hill, and all these people say, oh, it's Godzilla. I mean, how do they know?
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, talk a little bit about the challenges making the film at the time. Getting financing would be an adventure in itself, I guess, for your first independent feature.
Well, it was. We sort of naively said, we can do this. And we had the equipment because we had the commercial company. And we said, okay, we figured out we can do this for pretty low bucks. 10 of us, myself and a couple of my partners in the company and friends of ours, each kicked in $600, which was $6,000. And we thought maybe we could pull it off on that. We were, of course, also naive about that. It was absolutely impossible, but it got us started. We had dailies. We had film that we could show to people. My partners just literally went around and solicited money, and we wound up raising $70,000. That enabled us to finish the film, even though we owed more. It actually cost around $115, but we were able to pay that off when we finally got distribution. Today, it doesn't cost as much to make a film. I mean, because with video and all that, we actually have to shoot on film. A lot of people think, I've actually read people that have written about the film that we shot it in 16 millimeter, which is not true. We actually shot it in 35, and that's expensive. You can shoot video till the cows come home, and you're not spending a lot of money. But when you're shooting film, it's tremendously expensive to process it and make a print. Today, you can shoot a film on a lot less. It's harder today, though, to get a film distributed. I mean, I think we were sort of just at the right place at the right time. We were able to get an independent distributor to release the film, and we were lucky in a lot of ways.
It was only recent years that I saw a remastered version and appreciated just how crisp and clean, how much starker the black and white photography really was.
Yeah. I got so used to watching those bad prints that when I first saw the restored version, I said, this is not the right movie.
This is more like the Ingmar Bergman movie I had in mind.
Yeah, it doesn't look funky enough, man.
So how instant was the movie a success? Was it overnight, or did it take some time to develop that following?
Amazingly, it was very successful in its initial release. Now, that release was just drive-ins and neighborhood theaters around the U.S., but it actually returned money. I mean, we made, I think, $700,000 or something, split between 28 investors, so nobody ever got rich. But it actually made money, and we were able to pay off our debts. We came away saying, wow, this is a pretty easy business. Let's do it again, and which we did. But I was worried about being trapped in horror, and we made this little romantic comedy that nobody went to see. We were actually working on our third film when all of a sudden Night of the Living Dead had basically gone away. We thought it was over. It made its initial money for us and had its initial release, and we thought, okay, it's all gone. All of a sudden, it was discovered by the French. There's a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma who did this big, huge piece about the film, calling it essential American cinema, and which stunned all of us.
Wow.
Never expected anything like that to happen. And then it was invited into the Museum of Modern Art permanent collection, and all of a sudden it became Night of the Living Dead.
It has been established that persons who have recently died have been returning to life and committing acts of murder. The unburied dead are coming back to life and seeking human victims. It's hard for us here to believe what we're reporting to you, but it does seem to be a fact.
When we come back, George tells us about the development in his films of his critique of the socio-political landscape, starting with the Vietnam-era disillusionment of the late 1960s.
He planted the seeds of the zombie craze now sweeping the planet. Now he's gained a level of respectability.
You mean it's not seedy anymore? Please don't tell me it's not seedy anymore.
The George A. Romero interview on CJOB 68. He planted the seeds of the zombie craze now sweeping the planet. Now he's gained a level of respectability.
You mean it's not seedy anymore? Please don't tell me it's not seedy anymore.
The George A. Romero interview on CJOB 68.
Welcome back to our conversation with George A. Romero, grandfather of the zombie. Night of the Living Dead set the tone for all the horror films that followed in the 1970s. George, were you conscious of trying to make some kind of statement about the troubled times of that era?
I think the anger in the film, and if there is any sort of real political message in it, it's about peace and love had failed, and our impression of mankind was that it was continuing to disintegrate and not improve. The issue with Dwayne, the actor that played the lead role, he was the best actor from among our friends, and so we wound up asking him to do it, and he said yes. And he was keenly aware of how much stronger the film would be because he was black. And we were sort of aware of it, but we kept saying, come on, man, it's 1968. We should be past all that. And we were naive to it.
Helen, I have to get that gun.
Haven't you had enough?
2 people are dead already on account of that guy.
I don't want to hear any more from you, mister. If you stay up here, you take orders from me.
It was only during the process of making the film that we started, because of Dwayne, to become aware of how strong it was. When I wrote the script, the character in our minds was a white guy. The same things happened to him. He got shot by the posse.
All right, man. Hit him in the head, right between the eyes. Good shot. Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
We didn't change the script. We thought to ourselves, boy, we're being really hip by not changing this just because Dwayne is an African American. Never stopped to really carefully analyze how much stronger it was going to be. We finished the film in Pittsburgh, had an answer print, threw it in the trunk of a car, drove it to New York to show it to distributors. And the night that Russ Streiner, one of the producers, and I were driving to New York with the first print of Night of the Living Dead in the trunk of that car, and we heard on the car radio that Martin Luther King had been shot. And all of a sudden, bada bing, I mean, that then really made the film that much stronger again. And it's unintentional. I mean, I can't take certainly any credit for that. It was to some extent an accident. And if there's any credit that we deserve, it's just because we didn't change the script.
Very of its time, like you say, about the whole disintegration of the late 1960s ideal. It really holds up as a sort of a historical piece in a way.
Yeah, I was really looking for something. And again, I can't tell you how much the film business has a hell of a lot to do with luck. And the same thing happened there. People were coming after us saying, you have to do a sequel. And I said, wait a minute, I don't know. I have to really have a good idea before I ever go after a sequel.
Of course, after Night, you went on to make a number of films in the 1970s, including 2 horror cult classics, The Crazies, recently remade, and the acclaimed vampire story, Martin. But inspiration would soon be forthcoming for your next entry in the Dead series. We'll talk more about that when we come back.
He's the brains behind the zombie movie phenomenon.
No zombie has ever eaten brains in one of my movies.
No.
The George A. Romero Interview on CJOB 68. He's a horror movie icon who got his start on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
I don't know why Fred would hire a scary guy.
People must not bite other people.
But he did.
The George A. Romero Interview on CJOB 68.
Welcome back to our interview with George A. Romero. George, you said you resisted making a sequel to Night of the Living Dead for a number of years, but inspiration eventually struck in the form of one of the most mundane of modern-day institutions. Tell us about that.
I socially knew the people who were developing the first big shopping mall in and around Pittsburgh, and I went out to visit before it was even open. I said, okay, here's an idea for a movie.
If you've seen Night of the Living Dead, you've already had the appetizer. Now get ready for the main course, Dawn of the Dead, a gruesome reminder that we are what we eat. Dawn of the Dead.
When I finally got the idea, I went out to visit this shopping mall, and I saw it, and I said, wow. And it was the first time that I really got the idea that I could use this scenario. I could use zombies. I could use the genre to do social satire. Within 10 days of my visit to that mall, I got a call from an Italian horror director, Dario Argento, who had got my number from my agent and called me up and said he had money to make a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. And I said, gee, it so happens that I just got this idea. And he said, well, come to Rome. And he brought me to Rome, stuck me in an apartment, and said, write a script. And I did. Right? I mean, that's how it happened. It was just completely serendipitous. thankfully, ever since then, things have come a lot easier. But it was amazing those early years how, a few strokes of luck. I resisted sort of going to Hollywood and making a sequel for a studio. I did resist that. I've always been sort of a maverick that way and chosen to work independently. But luckily, my films have been successful enough that I'm still around and still able to do them. I think Night of the Living Dead is probably, in the end, the most successful of them all, because that film has been playing for 42 years. But we never had a copyright on that film. We flubbed. Our title was Night of the Flesh Eaters, and we stupidly put the copyright notice on the title card. And when the distributor changed the title to Night of the Living Dead, the copyright notice came off, and the film's been in public domain ever since. But I think that probably Night of the Living Dead, in the end, was huge. It's just that there was nobody keeping an accounting, It was the reason that we did a remake. It was the reason we allowed a colorized version, trying to reestablish a copyright on the film. Jack and I, my friend who co-wrote the screenplay, basically made a deal with each other and said, look, you go your way and I'll go mine. And we allowed each other to do any sequels that we wanted to do. And Jack did the Return of the Living Dead stuff. That's where it came from.
But you didn't come up with the brains thing.
Not me. No zombie has ever eaten brains in one of my movies.
No.
They're too weak. How are they going to crack a skull open?
They're omnivorous.
They don't run. They can't dig their way out of graves.
Oh.
They're too weak.
That's right.
They're dead.
Running zombies should be banned.
Listen. I actually have made T-shirts that say "Fast Zombies Suck."
Well, I'll be placing my order. Definitely. Dawn of the Dead, you certainly got involved with a very creative crew there, Tom Savini not being the least of which, very much instrumental in the success of that film. Talk about working with Tom Savini and his special effects work.
Well, Tom is just, first of all, he's a ball of energy. He's a great guy. He remains a great friend of mine. But he was a genius. I mean, he was able to improvise things. He was able to compensate. Making films is constantly compromising. And there are always things that come up and bite you on the butt. And you have to try to solve the problem quickly and efficiently. And Tom was great at that. And he's got this amazing energy on the set and a wonderfully creative thinker. I always tell this story. One of the gags in Dawn of the Dead, one of the main characters, it was a continuity error. He had a jacket tied around his waist, and we shot a scene we always shoot out of sequence, and we forgot to put the jacket on it. So we had to shoot a scene where he lost the jacket, and so we needed a zombie to grab the jacket. So now we needed to kill that zombie. Within 5 minutes, Savini went off and got a screwdriver and a soda straw, painted the soda straw silver, stuck it on the screwdriver so that, if you can imagine this, when you stab with the screwdriver, the soda straw collapses and it looks like the screwdriver is penetrating. And he said, okay, he'll stab this zombie in the ear with his screwdriver. And he rigged up a little squirter to squirt blood out of the straw. And it's one of the most effective and cringing scenes in the movie. And Tom came up with it in 2 minutes, on the spur of the moment.
There's certainly an element of humor in your films. Starting with Dawn, certainly there was pies in the face, in the zombies.
Literally, there was a pie fight.
That's right. But yet they were...
You really do know this stuff. I'm amazingly... This is great. I'm impressed. To me, I mentioned, I think, that I grew up on these EC comic books, again, before the comics code.
Yes.
Tales from the Crypt and all that. And the Crypt Keeper would introduce these grotesque, bizarre tales, always with puns. I mean, bad puns. It was all full of humor. It was all jokes. It was almost like stand-up comedy. And the stories in those comic books were always... The bad guys always got their comeuppance in some very sort of clever way.
Ironic
way. That, I'll never forget one where there was a nasty baseball player. His heart wound up being torn out and used as third base or something like that. And I just chuckled. I mean, I just got a tremendous chuckle out of this stuff always. Now, not everybody reacts that way, and I completely appreciate that. It's like, you know, not everybody likes Tabasco sauce, and not everybody likes roller coaster rides, but people that do react to those things gleefully. And I know that that's always been me. You know, maybe I need a shrink. But with Dawn of the Dead, I sort of relaxed into it, and I said, okay, man, we're going to have a good time here. Ever since then, I've really tried to make sure that there's, you know, at least a little bit of wit or some humor in it. And I'm sitting and writing a script, and if something silly occurs to me, I write it. I don't throw it away. You know, it's the Chuck Jones mentality, I think, Warner Brothers, right? The Coyote and the Roadrunner cartoons. It's fun to watch the coyote get damaged. And I think that in the world of horror, it's fun to watch zombies get damaged.
My favorite, the helicopter blade scene in Dawn of the Dead was certainly first, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's one of my faves, of course. I mean, it was another beautiful invention of Savini's. And he found a guy, and I go to these horror conventions every once in a while. And this guy, Jim Crutt, is always there. He's the helicopter zombie. He actually has a career signing autographs now because he's the helicopter zombie.
Oh, well.
But it's amazing. And Tom picked him because he had sort of a high forehead and a flat head. And he built this device on him that he could pull off with invisible threads from the side. And it was just beautifully inventive. We had to animate the helicopter blade, of course, because Jim wouldn't allow for us to use a real blade. I find that actors don't really want to be damaged.
Some actors are more willing to take chances, but that's going a little too far.
Going a little too far.
Yeah. Stay with us. We'll be back with more about the undercurrents of social satire in the films of our very special guest this evening, Mr. George A. Romero.
Today's undead may have the agility of Olympic sprinters, but the man who's the authority on the subject doesn't buy it.
I actually have made T-shirts that say, Fast Zombies Suck.
The George A. Romero Interview on CJOB 68. He's the brains behind the zombie movie phenomenon.
No zombie has ever eaten brains in one of my movies.
No.
The George A. Romero Interview on CJOB 68.
Welcome back to our very special interview tonight with the grandfather of the zombie horror filmmaker and master of the genre, Mr. George A. Romero. We're going to explore a little bit more about the themes of George's films, the underlying commentary on the ills of our modern society, and also his take on the direction horror films seem to be taking nowadays, for better or for worse. The themes in your films, George, tend to sort of revolve, regardless of the setting, how people reveal the best and the worst of themselves in stressful situations.
Best? You mean I've actually had someone reveal the best of themselves?
Yeah. I guess it's all relative.
Since I've mellowed with age, I think I've written a couple of characters who sort of realize the fruitlessness of it and the fact that, wait a minute, the rules have changed. We're not going to solve this. There is not going to be any cure.
Right.
Either God or the devil has changed the rules, and we better face up to it, or we're doomed. My stories are about how people fail to do that, keep on with the same old agendas without recognizing that things have changed. I will never do a film where the zombies take over the world, because in my mind, the zombie film is no fun without a bunch of stupid humans running around. I'm not very hopeful for a new beginning. I wish, I hope. I still hope that the aliens land one of these days and we all realize that we're not alone, and so we better behave.
That's right. Maybe we need a good spanking, just a little reminder, a Klaatu to come down or something.
Exactly.
Compared to the old guard of horror films, the old, the ones you went to the theater as a child to see, the Dracula and Frankenstein, and things inevitably were tidily wrapped up at the end. Even through the 50s, the brave hero scientists came up with the cure at the last minute to defeat the giant grasshoppers that were eating Pittsburgh, right?
Radioactive isotope.
That's right. High frequency sound waves. But there's no such tidy ending in George Romero's Dead films. Where would you say the change in the style of horror films came about? Some would say Psycho changed everything.
I think Psycho was a very hard-hitting film. I don't think that it necessarily changed everything, because things do work out in Psycho, and in fact we get this whole 10-minute coda at the end explaining exactly what we just saw.
This is true.
I do think, though, I don't consider myself an angry person. I guess I'm angry because people don't shape up. I mean, we thought peace and love had changed the world, and actually things turned out to be maybe even a little worse. I do think that the big change is the darkness. In other words, you don't wrap it up. I mean, in my mind, you don't wrap it up in nice ribbons and say, okay, it's over now. The reason to do horror, or the reason to do anything apocalyptic, is to upset the apple cart. And if you set the apple cart up again at the end, you're defeating what you set out to do in the first place. Starting with the second film, I said, well, wait a minute, I can enjoy some of my characters and save a couple of these characters, but it's not without saving the world. In other words, the disaster can go on, the phenomenon can continue. I can have one or two characters escape the immediate danger, but I don't want to have the world set right again. And I think that maybe that's what defines this sort of new age of horror. And unfortunately, I think it's gone maybe too far beyond that. I mean, I don't know, these torture porn films and so forth seem to paint this dreadful picture of, enjoyment out of torture. Or, I don't quite know what that's about. And I don't really see, any sort of a political or satirical message in it. I think it's just darkness, and we don't need that,
No. Sideshow for sideshow's sake.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not quite sure what that's about. I know that right after 9/11, it was impossible to sell. I had this conceit, because Night of the Living Dead was the 60s, and Dawn was 70s, Day of the Dead was 80s, and I really wanted to do something in the 90s. And I just sort of got sidetracked and couldn't make it happen. And then 9/11 happened, and nobody wanted any kind of hard-hitting stuff. For a while there, it was impossible. Everyone wanted something lighthearted and affirmative. It's funny how that stuff happens. I don't know. I also think that, basically in the United States, I think it's controlled basically by the industry. It's just like everything else, Government is controlled probably by industry to a great extent.
Right.
And so it's hard for me to trust any of it. It's a bureaucracy largely controlled by the studios. If you have a studio finance film, is going to be treated much more leniently than a little maverick like me.
We'll be back in a moment to talk a bit more about George Romero's experience in the Hollywood studio system and his eventual return to independent filmmaking, as well as some tantalizing information, especially for Winnipeg fans. Stay tuned.
He's a horror movie icon who got his start on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
I don't know why Fred would hire a scary guy.
People must not bite other people.
But he did.
The George A. Romero Interview on CJOB 68.
Welcome back to our interview with horror film legend George A. Romero, creator of the whole modern-day zombie subgenre. George, let's turn briefly to your experience working inside the Hollywood studio system. After the phenomenal success of Dawn of the Dead, you were pretty well sought after. During your Hollywood period...
My blue period?
I'm kind of thinking roughly the era from Creepshow to perhaps, the Dark Half.
Yeah, actually Creepshow was independent. When we made Dawn of the Dead, we didn't have U.S. distribution, and the movie was distributed first in Europe. Very successful, and so a U.S. distributor picked it up based on that success. That distributor also had an affiliated film production company. They said to us, we'll finance 4 movies for you. And they did. So, that was the best period of my life. Because it was like having a job. And they financed Creepshow, Day of the Dead, Night Riders, and it was we just went from one film to another. and they basically left me alone and gave me the creative control. Now, in the case of Creepshow, because we had stars in it and all that, they were able to sell it to Warner Brothers. So everyone thinks I made that film for Warner Brothers, but I didn't. I made it for the same small company, and Warner Brothers bought it. And it, by the way, is the only film that I've ever had that hit the #1 charts, variety charts.
Monkey Shines. It was a pretty entertaining thriller. I'm trying to recall exactly. He was a man confined to a wheelchair, young man, and he had a monkey trained to assist him, but the monkey goes nutso or something. I forget exactly why. It wasn't genetically modified monkey. I'm not.
Yeah, the monkey's been tampered with genetically.
Okay.
I love the movie. I mean, I love it a lot. The only thing I don't like about it is the ending. I mean, we were basically forced to change the ending by Orion. The only way the movie got made, this was right from day one, was they said the guy has to recover. We can't make a movie where the guy doesn't recover and be able to go off with his lover. Okay, so I did a lot of research, and I found an actual way that this guy could have been misdiagnosed and that he could recover. So that was fine. Not fine with me, but that was okay with me. What happens with a film is that you preview it for test audiences. Only after the film was released did we get to see the cards, and what people were complaining about was the fact that the guy recovered, not the darkness of the ending. That's the way it goes. The preview process is terrible. It's always previewed out on the West Coast somewhere, usually in Orange County, where every kid has a BMW or a Mercedes. I've actually gotten preview cards which say, I don't like the cars that your characters are driving. I mean, it's unbelievable. Yeah. And the studios react to this stuff. You know, they ought to preview it in Minneapolis or in Winnipeg, you know, wherever. But they don't. It's always sort of West Coast premieres, and the studios always have their own agendas. And if they want something to happen, they will sort of twist the results of the previews in order to make that happen. It's a very flawed process, and it's used to studio advantage all the time, and often to their detriment.
It must be very satisfying to be at the point where you're at now and kind of look back on your work and the kind of legacy you've left culturally. You know, the zombie films have crossed over. Maybe at one time they were that section of the video store that, you know, was a little seedy kind of a thing, some of the lesser titles on the shelf.
You mean it's not seedy anymore? Please don't tell me it's not seedy anymore.
You still got the edge, George. You still got it.
It certainly is stupefying, number one, and of course it's gratifying. All of a sudden, zombies have become, you know, hot. One of these days, a zombie's going to show up on Sesame Street and hang out with the Count. I mean, it's like, geez, what's going on here? The zombie, I don't know, it'll probably wind up eating something, but...
Maybe Elmo.
Stop him from giggling. Anything to stop him from giggling.
Where can you go with the zombie genre now? Can you kind of hint maybe where you'd like to take this saga to its inevitable conclusion?
What I'd love to do is 2 more films involving minor characters from Diary that go off on their own adventures and have people meet each other and have story points resolved and all that. Now, I don't know if this is going to happen. It largely will depend on how well Survival of the Dead does financially. I'm working on a script right now, which is a non-zombie. It's a horror film, but it's not a zombie film. Right now, I'm happy. I mean, I just literally finished a video release of Survival within the last couple of months, and I'm still traveling. In fact, I just got back from Europe promoting that, so I'm still promoting that film. I'm just waiting for the next shoe to drop.
George, it's been a supreme pleasure speaking with you, and I just want to thank you very much again and want you to know you've got a lot of fans here in Winnipeg.
Actually, I think that there's going to be a horror convention there soon, maybe early in the year. I don't know. I think that I'm booked for something over there.
Oh, why don't I know that? Wow.
I don't know. Why don't I know it? I'm terrible, but I know there's something going to be there for something. I think it's next year. I mean, it's after New Year's. So if you hear about that, show up and say hello.
Thanks very much, George.
Thank you very much. It's really been fun.
And thanks to everyone listening in tonight to join us for this very special Halloween presentation. I'm John Copsey. Happy Halloween. Stay safe and stay scared.
You've been listening to a CJOB 68 exclusive, Inside the Mind of George A. Romero, the grandfather of the zombie. Executive producer and host, John Copsey. The preceding program has been copyrighted and cannot be reproduced in any form without the written consent of CJOB 68, the Information Superstation.